Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Vitality Academy. We have a amazing webinar with you tonight. We had a wonderful opportunity in that we had technical challenges just before, so we had a riveting past few minutes, as I'm sure many of you have experienced before. But welcome to the Vitality Academy presentation. Today we're going to talk about the mind-body connection with the amazing Dr. Roshan Ramnarine. So welcome, Dr. Roshan. Great to have you here.
Nice.
And everyone, I'm going to take a moment to introduce Dr. Roshan as well as give you kind of technical stuff and real quick. So I'll briefly talk about Dr. Roshan. So he's part of the Ishtara Centre, which is located in Chaguanas, Trinidad. So, and by the way, if you're on this for the first time, welcome. We're glad you're here. So he was originally trained by Dr. Harry, who is the patriarch of the practice. And before he actually was training Roshan before he went into medical school. He trained in Grenada, the US, and the UK. And then he worked at 7 years at a private general practitioner, GP as they would call it. And then he worked in auricular therapy at Johns Hopkins University. He also trained in Qigong with Robert Peng. He did 1 year with the Endo IV laser, which is an amazing light therapy if you haven't checked it out. He did a couple years in clinical, and then all the personal stuff. The man's married, has a house, a couple kids, white picket fence, life is good. So with that, let me take it just 1 sec to give you some details on tech issues if you're having tech challenges. So this software, Big Marker, has the preference for using Google Chrome or Firefox. So if you're on another browser, ideally you're on those, okay? You'll have less issues. The other thing is speed is important. So if you're having, if you're sharing your internet with others, try to have them not watch YouTube videos while the webinar is happening, things like that, okay? And then if you have challenges, I'm gonna disappear here in just a moment, and I'll just be helping you guys out, answering any questions, trying to be here for technical support. There are a few people who are the other doctors in the practice. I'm not sure who's on, but I see Dr. Milash, and they will have, you'll actually see, just like Dr. Roshan, he's saying, hi, everyone. See his actual picture there? So if you have a picture next to their name, they're a doctor in the practice, all right? So they'll be there to answer questions live in the chat. And what'll happen as well is questions that pertain specifically to the talk that Dr. Roshan is having, I'm going to move over to the Q&A. And the Q&A will happen at 6-ish or so, in about an hour. So with that, Dr. Roshan, thank you for this exciting first few minutes of this webinar. And I'll let you have the stage. Thank you, my friend.
Thanks, Judd. Yeah, we got everything working behind the scenes with literally like 3 seconds to spare. So that I got the blood flowing and the heart pounding. So today's webinar is about the mind-body connection. Thank you all so much for joining. I'm really excited to be here. And as I alluded to in the sort of introductory email, this will be the last webinar I give for 2020. So I figured, well, why not? So as always with all my talks, I give a little outline, a little rundown as to what we're going to do. So I always start each webinar with, why is this lecture relevant? What sort of inspired or motivated me to give this talk? Then I think it's important we have a working definition of the mind, because there is a lively debate going on about that worldwide. So just for the purposes of this webinar, we'll sort of define the mind in that way. Then we'll move on to the probably mind-body connection, where I'll give just a few examples, I think 3 examples of some extraordinary people doing extraordinary things, sort of leveraging the mind-body connection in that way. Then we'll move on to that, the different ways in which the mind and body connect. This sort of brings up the second part of the webinar. And in this section, we'll talk about the hormones, we'll talk about the nervous system, we'll talk about the microbiome. And I'll focus on this talk on the gut microbiome specifically, because Dr. Harry would have given quite an extensive talk on the microbiome. So I'm just focusing on the gut microbiome or the gut flora. I'll use those two words interchangeably. And then we'll talk about the techniques to enhance the mind-body connection, which brings up the third part of today's webinar. And I'll talk briefly on meditation, give some breathing exercises, the power of physical discipline. And I've added to here sort of last minute, some neurofeedback as well. So that'll be the fourth point, or fourth technique in which we can enhance the mind-body connection. And then, as always, the take-home point, if, just sort of distilling the essence of the webinar into just a couple of words. So that's the roadmap for today. That's what we'll be following, sort of generally. And with that being said, let's kick it off. And so, why this lecture is relevant? It sort of pertains to the human body, and these are the four pillars which I usually say makes up the sort of human being: the spirit, emotions, the mind, and the body. And earlier in the year, I gave a couple of talks which sort of covered loosely the sort of esoteric, sort of amorphous concepts that sort of bind all of us together. And so I figured, just to sort of round it out quite neatly, I'll talk about the mind and the body. I think John and Dr. Lash gave a couple talks on fitness and fasting and all that good stuff, which were really excellent. And so I'll sort of tailor my talk in between there. All of us sort of alluded to the mind-body connection in our previous webinars, Dr. Harry, Dr. Adriel, Dr. Lash. And so I'll devote this webinar to sort of fleshing that concept out. We all touched on it ever so slightly under the broader context of the whatever the webinar was about. But this webinar is sort of devoted to fleshing that concept out. So that's the relevance of today's talk. That's what sort of inspired me and motivated me to sort of bring this to you guys today. So let's define the mind. I'll just put this slide there for a second, but just to talk a little bit conventionally or typically, there's actually a lively debate in the psychology field, given this small amount of research I did, when I Googled what's the mind. And there's pages upon pages of debate about whether the mind is physical, whether the mind is non-physical, or whether it's a combination of both. And so for the purposes of this webinar, I mean, I think the answer, is sort of somewhere in the middle, because I'm a sort of middle of the road balanced sort of guy. And I mean, in clinical experience, when you meet patients with a traumatic brain injury, for instance, where they've had some sort of injury to the brain, the physical brain, their mind is different. Their personality could be different. Sometimes if it's really severe, they could sort of they lose consciousness totally. And then we have certain psychoactive drugs, for instance, which sort of alter our mind in a sense. So I'm with that, I have to accept that mind does have a physical component to it. But on the other hand, our mind is made up of thoughts, for instance, which aren't physical. I can't exactly say to you, hey, look, this is a pound of thoughts, and so there's also a large non-physical component here as well. So that's my take on the mind on a sort of conventional level. But I want to talk a little bit about the mind in terms of the sort of energetic aspect, which is what we really do in Ishtara, bioenergy work. So I'll talk a little bit about the chakras first, because we as you all know, these are the 7 chakras. The base chakra usually helps to ground us, connect us to the earth. The sacral chakra is where we store our sort of male and female energies. The solar plexus, which the sacral chakra is right sort of by our belly button. The root chakra is at the base of our spine. The solar plexus, which sits right sort of below our rib cage, right where our sort of stomach is. That deals with our inner power, or sort of self-confidence. The heart chakra sits where the heart is, and that's our emotional seat. And the throat chakra sits, well, right there, and that deals with our self-expression. So, notice how I sort of drew a line there because, based on my discussions with Dr. Harry, we found that these 5 chakras, they constitute the body. And with that, the body is fairly standard in a sense. For instance, the sacral chakra with the male and female energies, we all have a balance of male and female energies. So we all have that. We're all united by that. We all share self-esteem and self-confidence. We all have emotions. We all express ourselves. We all grounded to the earth. And so these things are fairly standard amongst all human beings, And the body as well. The body is fairly standard. We all have one head, 4 limbs, so to speak. And that's fairly standard. And that's in a sort of very black and white box. But then we cross that line and we get to the brow chakra, which in our discussions deal with the mind. And the mind is quite different because, yes, we all share a brain, yes, but our minds work remarkably different. And I don't even need to give any examples for you all to understand that, because just as our fingerprint unique to each of us, our mind is different. We all think in different ways, and we're all sort of limited, and our mind is shaped and limited and sculpted by all of our experiences and our life experience, the way we were taught, the way we were brought up, our joys, our sorrows, and how we react to these things. These things make up the mind and the constructs that are within the mind. Dr. Ari always refers to them as the programming, in a sense. And that's something that we've worked in Ishtara to sort of change and mold and reshift in our patients from a sort of unhealthy programming to something that serves the patient better. And so the mind and the brow chakra could be as expansive, literally, as far as we could imagine it. That is how wide the scope is for the mind, unlike the body. And then crossing even above that line now, up to the crown chakra, that deals with the spirit. And that connects us all. That's the divine connection. I spoke a little bit about the concept of the mathematical symbol of pi in a previous webinar, and that connects us all. But we'll focus our talk on the mind itself. And so these are sort of the two different ways in which we define the mind. One in the sort of conventional way, in a sense, and in this more esoteric way. And so that's the sort of working definition we'll use for this webinar. So moving on now to the power of the mind-body connection. These are three guys who I look at, and I see what I see through their work and through their journey. They've mastered that mind-body connection. So, I'm just using three examples. I'm not, I won't stay too long on this, because it's something that inspired me and helps me throughout my daily life when I'm sort of finding it difficult. When I have a challenge, I think of these guys and the challenges they must have faced, and just exactly how they overcome them. So the first guy I'll talk about is a gentleman by the name of Mr. David Goggins. And I wrote pull-ups there because that's what I am sort of talking about him for this webinar. Mr. David Goggins was the former world record holder for the amount of pull-ups done in a 24-hour period. Now, I could do maybe 5-10 pull-ups. I'm not that super strong if I try really hard. And perhaps in a 24-hour period, I could do a lot more. And there are some pretty strong guys out there who can do maybe a couple hundred pull-ups in a 24-hour period. Mr. David Goggins in a 24-hour period did 4,030 pull-ups in a 24-hour period. And that must not have been nice for him. His body must have been screaming at him for the vast majority of that 24-hour period to stop, But yet he used his mind to sort of calm down the body. He used his mind to sort of relax his body a little bit and to allow his body to bend to his will almost, and have his body go along with what he wanted to do. And that right there sort of illustrates the mind-body connection. This is a picture of Mr. David Goggins before and after. And he looked like a pretty average Joe. And reading his memoirs, he was by all means a pretty average Joe. And now he's an ultra marathoner. He was a former world record holder. He's actually been dubbed the world's toughest man. And the reason he's been dubbed that is because he's actually, I believe, the only person ever to complete Navy SEAL training, to complete Air Force Air Tactical Controller training, and to complete US Army Ranger training. And each one of these trainings are meant to weed out sort of weak-minded individuals. The strongest people don't necessarily get through. The fittest don't necessarily get through. It's the ones with the strongest mind that get through these types of training, because these types of training are meant to really prepare you for the harsh realities of combat. And it seems as if Mr. Goggins just relished these kind of things, and he was able to really get his body to do what his mind wants him to do. And so that was one example of Mr. Goggins, and he's well known for saying that we must callous our mind. The same way a guitar player through practice calluses his fingers, for instance, or the ballerina through practice calluses her toes. We must callous our mind through practice and through application and use. So that's Mr. David Goggins. The next chap that's up is Mr. Herbert Niche, and he is known for freediving. For those of us who didn't know, I didn't know much about freediving before this, but it's just very simply a sport where you dive deep down without the use of any supplemental oxygen. essentially going just on what your lungs could hold. Um, Mr. Robert Nish holds, I believe, 32 world records for the freediving in the different disciplines in the sort of competitive sport of freediving. And his deepest dive, which I think wasn't recorded because he injured himself, his deepest dive was actually 831 meters, I believe, or 31 feet, sorry, I believe. And to put that into perspective, the sort of Trinidadian Twin Towers, they're 302 feet high. And so that's his dive was essentially taking 2 and 3/4 of those towers and stacking them one on top of each other, down and up. And that to me was completely mind blowing, you know. And in order to free dive effectively, we have to not just control our mind, but we have to control our heart rate. We have to control our metabolic rate because all of these things consume oxygen. And so to be an effective freediver, you really need to learn to master your body. And so what's pretty interesting about Mr. Nish was that when he got injured, I sort of played down his injury. He came up too quickly on that dive, and he actually suffered multiple strokes, and he lost use of half of his body, and he was wheelchair bound. Now that would have been the end of him. For most of us, that would be the end of us. But Mr. Nish, through his training, through his discipline, and through his mind-body connection, he actually left his long-term care facility after about 5 months, and he said, you know what, I got this, guys. And so he got together a team of his own. He worked on himself, and today he's back in the water, all four limbs, freediving again. And that to me was sort of extraordinary upon extraordinary upon extraordinary. This man is something else. And this is a picture of him there, just relaxing underwater, having a blast. He is known as the deepest man on earth. And so the final example I'll give of someone who's able to leverage a mind-body connection is a runner by the name of Mr. Eliud Kipchoge. I think that's how his name is pronounced. We all know the Usain Bolt who did the sub 10 second 100 meter sprint, and that was again amazing by itself. But Mr. Kipchoge was the first gentleman to run a full marathon below the 2-hour time limit. Now, this was under ideal conditions. He had a lot of world-class pacing runners. He had the course was selected carefully. The weather was perfect. But previous attempts were made under these ideal conditions before, even by him. And it didn't happen. And it was thought to be previously impossible by many elite world-class runners, by the World Running Federation, all these things, that this is a human barrier we've reached, and there's no way that someone could run a sub 2-hour marathon. And it just so happened that Elio was able to do it. And to me, that's something quite interesting because, again, it wasn't the training, it wasn't the weather. Those things were constant. What it was that made the difference that day, I'm sure, was here. That time there, that he was the difference between 1 or 2 extra steps. That's the sort of tolerances we're looking at. And I mean, that's the power of the mind right there, at his work. And there's also a very other interesting phenomenon. When a human being breaks a seemingly unbreakable human barrier, we found it in history that other people start to do it as well. And so what was it that prevented all these other runners or people or whatever the discipline was? What prevented them from doing this before? And what it was that, hey, you know something? This is actually possible. So you know what? If it's possible, then I can do it. So we have to ask ourselves, if Mr. Kipchoge could have actually envisioned himself being able to do this, what can we do that was previously thought to be impossible? What about our high blood sugar, our hypertension, these pains, the migraines that we suffer with, the pains that we just accept that we have to have that will get worse over time? What if we never accepted these things before? What if we said to ourselves, you know something? I think I could beat this. And let me now center my life around beating this. Let me now have a look and see how best can I structure my life, my diet, my exercise, my meditation, my family time, my human connection, my connection with the divine. How best can I sort of craft my life in such a way that I can now overcome this obstacle that perhaps I thought that was impossible to do. And so these guys, I, in times when I'm a bit frustrated, when I feel that, whether it is tiredness or frustration or whatever it is, whatever human condition I'm suffering from at that moment, I think of these guys, and the work that they must have done, the mental barriers that they must have just sort of just broken through, the dark times that they must have suffered when they failed. And despite all of these things, they've achieved the unachievable, and so I I ask you guys, who do you know? Who are you familiar with? Which persona are you aware of that has done the undoable? And why not look to them for encouragement? And then with enough of that, with enough looking at them to encouragement, we now may be able to find within ourselves the power and the ability to overcome our own obstacles. And then we now may be people that others can look to for support. So this is something that I always, that is something that is dear and near to my heart. And I'm happy to share this with you all today. So that sort of wraps up the first sort of segment of today's talk, the mind-body connection. And just the sheer power, of what it can do. So moving along now to the second part of today's talk, the different ways in which the mind and body connect. We will chit chat about the hormones in the nervous system and the gut microbiome. Let me talk about the hormones first, because we can't talk about the mind without talking about things that affect the brain. So the first hormone, melatonin. I've always said that we have a sort of love-hate relationship with melatonin, because this hormone is what helps us to feel sleepy, and we're always drinking coffee and tea with caffeine to sort of help us feel not sleepy. So we have a sort of love-hate relationship with it. And so melatonin is something that it makes us sleepy because it gets inactivated by blue light. Now, historically, blue light would have been, the biggest source of blue light would have been the sun, So when the sun rises in the morning, it inactivates all the melatonin in our brain, and we don't feel sleepy anymore. We're awake, we're alert, and we can go ahead and do our daily activities. And then when the sun goes down, there's no more sort of blue light. Then melatonin is able to accumulate now, make us feel sleepy, and then we go to bed. And that sort of is what controls our sleep-wake cycle in a sense. But the issue is that nowadays, with the advent of big computer screens, phones that we sort of lie at night right in our eyes, those things have a lot of blue light in it. And the reason for that is because blue light increases contrast. And so screen manufacturers are sort of really happy to put in blue light in those screens because it really makes colors pop in a sense. They've actually recognized this, lots of them, and most people have a sort of night mode, which warms up the sort of screen and reduces the amount of blue light. But as most of you all know, who's ever used night mode, the screen just doesn't look as nice. The colors don't pop as well. The contrast isn't there. So even myself, sometimes if I'm up at night and I'm doing work on the computer, I turn off the night mode because it's hard for me to see. So, and with melatonin now, with that, we don't feel sleepy. And we have trouble sleeping because of the preponderance of blue light all over the place. And it troubles our sleep. And I always say that when we go to bed, that's when the housekeeping in our brain and our mind comes out. I use the librarian analogy in the sense that when we go to bed, the librarian comes out and it sort of catalogs all the memories that we accumulated throughout the day, so that when time comes, we know exactly where to recall that particular memory from. But if we don't sleep well now, we're unable to catalog those memories and do whatever necessary housekeeping the brain and mind needs. And so whenever someone comes to me and they say, Doc, my memory is really poor, one of the first questions I ask is, any specific medical issues aside, how are you sleeping? And the general answer is, well, not so well, whether it is because of the blue light, whether it is because of stress, whether it is because of a little baby keeping them up. The trouble sleep, I always say, equals trouble mind. And so we can now use this melatonin now. Now that we understand what helps us to feel sleepy, we can now use this to help us get to sleep better. So for instance, in the bedrooms, don't have those cool blue LEDs or those cool blue fluorescent lights. In my bedroom, I have red lights. And in the bathroom, I have little night lights so that I can see where I'm going without sort of flicking the switch and having that harsh blue light in my eyes at night. So again, learning how to control this physical hormone will help us now to control something non-physical, such as sleep. That's the sort of mind-body connection, and that's melatonin. Um, Talking about dopamine is probably one of the most famous hormones because it's known as the pleasure or the reward hormone. Think of whenever we had that perfect slice of a birthday cake, or granny's roti, or some lovely meal. And that sort of oh man, it feels so good. That's dopamine. In addition to not just food, but whenever we sort of accomplish any goal, for instance, we get this huge rush of dopamine. So there was a time in my life where I used to run quite a lot, and I would attend races. And for these races, I would have to get up like 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning to get there on time, and then finish the race. And it wasn't just I wasn't the only person in the race. It was a big group of people. And so someone who didn't understand what was going on, they would look at what was going on from a sort of bird's eye perspective and think that these people are crazy. What motivates you to get out of bed at such an ungodly hour? Go now to run a 5K, 10K, half marathon, whatever it may be. Suffer, in the hot sun, and then you get a medal after. What's the point of that? But you would not believe the dopamine rush that you get when you cross that literal finish line. And the thing is, it's not just you alone, because there's a crowd of people doing the same thing. There's this sort of shared collective energy, and everyone's on a big dopamine high, high-fiving, hugging, congratulating each other. And that huge dopamine surge is what motivates people, is what motivated me to get up at such ungodly hours, leave my family, the comfort of my bed, and go and do those crazy things. And with that, we can now take that now and translate it to not the literal finish line, but the metaphorical finish line. And so for folks who feel demotivated, for folks who feel like they can't find the will to go on, or they're frustrated, or they come up against a block, I say to them, hey, set small goals, small, easily attainable goals. And as you cross that metaphorical finish line, you get a small hit of dopamine, right? And with that gives you the encouragement, that gives you the motivation to go on. These big social media companies, for instance, they know that sort of mechanism all too well. Let's say, for instance, there's a picture or some post or some article that I wrote and I post it online. Every time I get a little notification on my phone saying, hey, this person liked your post, this person liked your post, there's a little dopamine surge that goes on in my brain there. And these companies know that, because that now will help motivate me to post more content. And then I'll get more likes, and then I'll post more content and I get more likes. So that's how it works. So learning now how to leverage that reward center, rather than being sort of buffeted by it and just being sort of a victim because you're not aware of how the mechanics work, we can use this little dopamine hit now every so often to help us to get over those little humps. When I intermittent fast, for instance, when I, every day when I'm working, I usually fast. When I break that fast, sometimes what I would say is, you know what, I think I could push this fast for an next hour, and by pushing the fast for an extra hour, the reward I get when I do break my fast, oh man, I did that extra fast, I did that extra hour, oh, good job, and when you wouldn't believe, when I choose to do that extra hour is when I'm having a difficult day. Once I'm not sort of keeling over and lacking energy, when I'm having a difficult day, I say, you know what, let me fast for an extra hour, if it's possible, 2 hours. So when I do break my fast now, wow, I feel like I've accomplished something for today. And that, when I do break my fast in the afternoon, that gives me the juice, the motivation now to finish the day with some level of verve and gusto. So that's how I leverage the sort of dopamine reward center in my brain. And so you can now figure out how you can help your mind, whatever mind blocks that you're facing, overcome those mind blocks with using that dopamine reward system. So moving on to oxytocin, I sort of added an oxytocin here last, so you'll notice that it disappears with the next slide. But using oxytocin now as a really good example of a hormone that does something that is really, really amorphous, that it's not really tangible. Oxytocin is the hormone that helps us to connect to one another, that binds us together. So, for instance, during childbirth, the hormone that causes the womb to contract is oxytocin. But also interestingly, when the mother breastfeeds the baby, oxytocin, a huge flush of oxytocin is released in the mother's brain. And by breastfeeding the baby, for instance, that also helps to contract the womb. So there's less bleeding after delivery. So, our bodies, the woman's bodies are made up really well to give birth, And so that's why breastfeeding is so important, and establishing breastfeeding early is really important. And so by the mother breastfeeding the baby, she is now powerfully bonded to that baby through the action of oxytocin. And another time oxytocin is released is when, for instance, couples are intimate with each other. In both parties, there's this huge surge of oxytocin, and that helps to bind us together, And so anyone who's had a lover's quarrel, for instance, and the happy aftermath of that, would know the power of oxytocin and how powerfully it binds us together. And so again, using that to help bind us together is important, And so I'll mention that and add that in there. Moving on to cortisol and adrenaline, I put those two together because what's common between both of them is that they're both released in response to stress, And I will put up the next slide there, the fight or flight response. And so when we are stressed out, cortisol and adrenaline are released into our blood. Now they both do a whole host of actions. They do quite a lot of things, right? Cortisol is known sometimes colloquially as the stress hormone, but I'll focus on just a couple actions of these very powerful hormones. Taking cortisol first, cortisol helps to increase our blood sugar, and it hits the off button on the immune system. And I'll put that in context just now. And adrenaline, what adrenaline does is it increases the heart rate, and it contracts all the capillaries and the blood vessels in the gut to send blood to the muscles of our arms and legs to be able to fight or flight or to run away. Now, when we're in a fight or flight mode, our muscles, or when I fight for life, for instance, our muscles need fuel. Hence, that's why cortisol raises our blood sugar. So that sugar now is able to fuel those muscles that are working to save our life. Additionally, when we're in a situation where we have to either run away to save our lives or to fight to save our lives, when we're stressed out, we don't need to be fighting infection at that point, And the immune system doesn't just fight infection; it has a large role in just the normal sort of housekeeping of the body. And so, because we don't need to be doing that and sort of allocating vital life force to those functions, the immune system is sort of switched off. And so the thing is, evolutionarily, that sort of cascade of reactions helped us quite a lot, because back in the day, our biggest stressors was threats to our lives, whether it was a saber-tooth tiger, whether it was another human being trying to kill us and take our land, whatever it may be. But evolutionarily, that mechanism served us really, really well. But the issue nowadays is that most of us are relatively safe. So, and I don't think any of us in this chat engage in a fight for our lives on a daily basis, So the problem now is that the saber-tooth tiger is chasing us every day because we live in times of pandemics, We have overbearing bosses, we have difficult marriages, we have stressful households. And so with that, we are constantly stressed out. And that mechanism that served us well before, because life has changed now significantly, this mechanism doesn't help us, it actually harms us. So for instance, because cortisol raises blood sugar, right? It puts us at risk for diabetes. And because it raises blood sugar, it increases the amount of insulin in our blood. And insulin is the hormone of storage. Hence, once there's insulin bubbling in the blood, we will store stuff in the form of fat. And so that's how sort of being stressed out correlates to some people gaining weight in a sense because of the increased blood sugar. And then, for instance, with adrenaline, because we're, there is a sort of slightly diminished blood supply to the intestines. A lot of us have indigestion when we're stressed out. Stress directly affects our gut because of that. And it sort of increases our blood pressure significantly, which again used to serve us well before. So for instance, a lot of patients who come to me and they're diagnosed with hypertension and they're on hypertension medications, I ask them, one of the first questions I ask them is, how stressed out are you? And upward of 99% of most people say, doc, I'm really stressed out, which most of us are. And so by actually helping the patient to teach them coping mechanisms, to show them ways in which they can sort of decrease their stress levels, then what happens is the blood pressure naturally comes down. Some patients even call me, doc, I'm taking this blood pressure tablet the same way I used to while doing stress exercises or stress relieving exercises. And whenever I take the tablet, I feel sick, I feel dizzy, I feel lightheaded. I say, good. Now we can talk about, perhaps in a very controlled manner, sort of coming down on your dose of blood pressure tablets. And so just being able now to recognize that these non-physical things like stress, for instance, have very, very real physical and physiological effects is another way of showing us this mind-body connection. And hope now that we're enlightened to it, we can start now using it to our benefit. And so I sort of touched on the fight or flight response there. And so I'll move on now under the nervous system, because the hormonal system and the nervous system, they work sort of in sync together. Very rarely they work separately and apart from each other. And so the other half of the nervous system, or the autonomic nervous system, as we call it, is the rest and digest system. Now, just to be perfectly specific, the fight or flight response is controlled by what we call the sympathetic nervous system, right? And the rest and digest part of our nervous system is controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system. And both of these together, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, they are both called the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic because it's automatic. We don't really control it. We don't sort of will it and control it with our mind usually, or at least we don't have to. Again, I guess the whole point of this webinar is how to control these things. So, so anyway, so the parasympathetic nervous system controls the rest and digest aspect of our body, and that does the exact opposite now of the sympathetic nervous system or the fight or flight response. The parasympathetic nervous system or the rest and digest aspect, it sort of increases blood flow to the gut because it's activated when we eat, especially when we eat fats. That increases the parasympathetic nervous system when you rest and digest. So it increases blood flow to the gut. It reduces the heart rate. It reduces blood pressure. All of these things, it sort of slackens and loosens. Whereas the fight or flight or the sympathetic nervous system, it sort of tightens up and and make things ready to roll. And so the parasympathetic nervous system is also mediated by the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is Latin. Vagus is Latin for wandering, because this nerve sort of wanders throughout the body and sort of does everything with the parasympathetic nervous system or the rest and digest system. And so in the next part of the webinar, when we're talking about techniques, we will talk about ways in which we can activate the vagus nerve. Very simple to activate the vagus nerve. Now, moving on to the gut microbiome, or the gut flora to be specific, I'd like to talk about GABA. GABA is big fancy term for GABA is gamma aminobutyric acid, but we just call it GABA for short. And GABA does something pretty interesting. GABA is our gut flora, or GABA is produced in large quantities in our gut, right? GABA has anti-fear and anti-anxiety properties because GABA is a neurotransmitter, right? The GABA molecule actually helps to make connections between certain neurons in our brain. So our gut flora that resides sort of quite a distance from our brains has the ability to produce a molecule that helps to alter our levels of fear and our levels of anxiety. And so this is really important when we're talking about a disturbed gut flora, and so that's GABA, and that's a really, really important molecule. And also serotonin. You would be surprised to find out. I was actually surprised to find out that 90% of our serotonin is actually stored in our gut, interestingly enough. And serotonin, very much like dopamine, is known as a happy hormone. It helps regulate our mood, a bunch of in addition to a bunch of other different things. It really helps to elevate our mood and make us feel happy. Now, why is this relevant for? Because our mental state, our mind, is affected in a big way by our gut flora. And these two I mean, there are a bunch of different ways it's affected, but I just sort of chose to speak about these two in particular. Because once there is disturbance in our gut flora, our mental state and our mood is affected. Just for those of us who don't know what the gut flora is, it's just a sort of community of happy, healthy bacteria that lives within our gut. I've always been fascinated by the gut flora because when we're born, our gut is sterile. When we have no bacteria in our gut. And over time, it gets colonized by happy, healthy bacteria. And so these little critters, they're part of us because they do quite a lot of work for us, just based on what I said. They're part of us, but they're not from us, which I found was a very interesting sort of perspective. They're not ours. We didn't make them, but they're sort of part of us, and they help us to interact with the world in that way. And if they were to die, we would get really, really sick and possibly even die as well. And so two things that really disturb the gut flora is sugar, because sugar sort of increases the growth of bad bacteria, and then that now would sort of compete with the good, happy, healthy bacteria. And then flour, because most of the flour produced today is sort of tainted with a really powerful weedicide. And so anything that's from the wheat plant, so wheat germ, cream of wheat, whole wheat, bran, white flour, all of these things, most of it is tainted with this powerful weedicide. And so you can just imagine what happens when we consume this flour with that weedicide in it, and it hits our happy, healthy bacteria. So bacteria meets weedicide, it's not happy. It's not happy. That's why we get bloaty, gassy, all of these things. And for instance, most people with reflux have anxiety as well. Most people with irritable bowel syndrome have anxiety as well. There's a very, very strong connection with the gut and the mind. And so these are ways now. My hope is that talking about different ways in which the mind and body connect, and hopefully my hope is that you guys now will have a better idea now of how to leverage. You don't have to use all of these things. For instance, if you have trouble sleeping, you could use melatonin to your advantage, and so different ways in which you can alter your life in such a way to make use of these hormones and have these hormones work for you rather than just having them there and not being controlled. You can now start taking back control of your body, and by extension, these things from your body which control your mind. So that sort of ends the second part of today's talk. I wanted to talk about this because this is pretty interesting. This was a research article. No, this wasn't. This was an article published that talked about hydrotherapy. And this article, what it did was they submerged people in 32 degrees, 20 degrees, and I think and a lower temperature as well, from neck downwards, to see the physiological and physical effect. And it was actually really interesting. So I just used I just sort of took a screenshot of two, the 20-degree one and the 32-degree one. And there's a lot of words there. Please don't be frightened. But I underlined that when someone is immersed at 32 degrees, it did not change their metabolic rate, but it lowered their heart rate and their blood pressure. And interestingly, it lowered their cholesterol by 34%. And not cholesterol, sorry, cortisol. So if it lowered your cortisol by 34%, then that means that your body is no longer in this stress response stage. But interestingly, when you immersed at 20%, it increased your metabolic rate by 93%. And when you're immersed at 14 degrees, it was a couple 100%. It actually increased your metabolic rate by. And it further decreased the plasma cortisol concentrations as well. So why is this relevant? Because what I do every day before I go to work is when I'm sort of on the tail end of my shower, I warm up my shower just a little bit to sort of get my body temperature a little high. And then wham, I turn the temperature to really cool, and I just sort of let that cool water hit me, and it knocks the wind out of me. But I sort of, and it helps. So in addition to waking me up, what it does is it helps to decrease cortisol, it increases my metabolic rate, and it decreases my blood pressure. So I start the day with my metabolic rate up, even without having breakfast, because they say breakfast is it sort of increases the metabolic rate. So because I fast, I skip breakfast. And so this is how I practically apply this piece of information to my life. And I would share that with you guys because That's what I do. I don't have access to an ice bath where I can actually Dr. Adriel bought an ice bath recently because he realized the importance of this as well. And so because some people do that when we finished UE half marathon, they actually put us in ice baths as well. Quite interestingly enough. So I hope you guys will find some help with this because when I first did it, it was really uncomfortable because it was super duper cold. But not that I've gotten accustomed to doing it. It's fine, and for those of you who are starting off, you don't have to warm up your shower first before you turn it cold, or do it slowly, sort of ease yourself into it, because I don't want anybody sort of having cold water hit them first thing in the morning. They won't have happy thoughts about me. So that's this little article I found quite interesting. So moving on now to the third and final part of today's talk. I see we have about 15 minutes again. Techniques to enhance the mind-body connection. We will talk about meditation, breathing, and physical discipline. I talked a little bit about meditation in my previous talk. I talked about grounding, and I'll just quickly rehash it again today because I can't stress the importance of grounding and really the benefits behind it. Grounding is what it is. It's sort of self-explanatory. We connect to the earth actively and physically in a sense. So what I usually ask patients to do is, for 15 minutes every day, twice a day actually, in the morning and in the evening, once they have grass or dirt available, just find a nice patch, make sure there isn't any old nails or ants or anything like that, plop the patio chair down and just sit quietly with the bare foot touching the grass. And what that does, once we connect to the earth in that way, in a sort of solemn and sincere way, it has a sort of drawing down effect. The earth, what she does is all this excess energy we have here that stops us from sleeping well, and it has us quite frazzled and sort of encumbered. It sort of pulls it down. The sort of silly analogy I use is, think of our body like a slice of toast, and all the butter is sort of spread right here. So when we connect to the earth, the butter knife comes and just sort of spreads it evenly throughout our body, enhancing our base or root chakra in a sense. The active part of this exercise I recommend is by focusing on one thing alone, keeping our mind as still as possible while doing this exercise. And so what I ask patients to do is just feel the sun on your face for a minute or 2 minutes. Just concentrate on that and keep that alone in your mind. But then, just like when someone comes into a room and you get a smell of perfume, but then in a few minutes it goes away because your body gets accustomed to it. Eventually, when you're focusing on the sun on your face, you get accustomed to that. And then what will happen is your mind will start to wander. We have to be mindful of that and bring the wandering mind back by shifting focus now to something else, perhaps the wind in your hair or the sound of life, for instance. So every time your mind wanders, shift the focus. You're still in the present, and you still only have one thought at a time, but you're just shifting focus to keep the mind in the present. And again, the reason why this is important is because, again, I give a sort of silly analogy of we all have a metaphorical tank in our body that holds all of our stress. And that stress causes disease when that tank overflows, because we can't avoid stress the same way we can't avoid taxes. It's something that just it's something that's there and we all have to do. And so, but what we can do is learn how to empty that tank. And so by doing this simple exercise, or any exercise that you're happy with, for 15 minutes in the morning, ensures that the tank is completely empty. So as you progress through the day, we can take on stress, right, in a safe way. And then when we do it at night now, we're able to empty that tank again. So it doesn't disturb our sleep, and we're able to sleep better. And then we do it in the morning again. So whatever stress is from the morning routine, empty that tank so we can now continue the day, take on more stress in a safe, healthy way, and we keep going with that. So that's one of the reasons why I'm really happy with this exercise. But moving along to the other way, this was a really interesting research article that came out of Yale University. And essentially what this article talked about was they took a group of people. They had two groups of people. One was the control that they didn't do anything with. And the other group, they taught them 3 different exercises. The first was what they called a third eye meditation. Then they did cyclical breathing with breath holding. And the third was cool water immersion, what we talked about before. And they did this for 10 days, right, with this particular group. At the end of the 10 days, on the 11th day, both groups were injected with a toxin from a particular bacteria. And in the sort of hours and days after, the researchers drew sort of serial blood samples from these people, from both groups, to see there's a difference. And interestingly, the group that practice those three exercises, the meditation, the breath, the breathing exercise, and the cold water immersion, they actually had significantly less inflammation in response to that toxin than the sort of control group, or the group that did nothing. And so it's just a research article, but it has very interesting implications. Is that perhaps this article demonstrates there is a very real and tangible response to an exercise that doesn't really have a tangible purpose, in the sense that, meditation doesn't have it focuses on the mind, body, spirit, emotional aspect of ourselves, but that translates now to a very real change within our physical body. And so I thought I would sort of include this article again just as a way of demonstrating the power of that mind body connection. So that's meditation and grounding. Breathing, we talked about 3 breaths a minute, I think in Dr. Harry's webinar on building dark energies, because 3 breaths a minute, what he found was breathing at 3 breaths a minute increased our ability to produce dark energies. And dark energies being highly regenerative, highly calming energies that put us in a state of good health. But breathing at 3 breaths a minute, what it does physiologically or physically, it activates the vagus nerve. Remember, I talked about the parasympathetic nervous system in the previous section, and we talked about that system is what mediates the rest and digest part of ourselves. So by breathing at 3 breaths a minute, or any breath exercise for that matter, it activates the vagus nerve. And in activating the vagus nerve, it helps now to put us in this rest and digest state. Now, I don't think that the fight or flight response or the stress response and the rest and digest response, I don't think there's one or the other that's better. They're both equally important because they serve very distinct, very polar purposes. But balance is key. And so, for instance, if we have a preponderance of stress, if we have a very stressful life, if we're overflowing with work or responsibilities, using these things help us significantly to help now bring balance back by helping to activate and get to know back the parasympathetic nervous system. And so, and in a couple times I did it with patients in the office, what I did was I used my phone and with the stop clock on my phone, and I said, hey, let's just breathe at 3 breaths a minute for 1 minute and see how we feel after. And to do that, I mean, we have to breathe at 10 seconds in gradually, then 10 seconds out. And that's 20 seconds. So it's 20 seconds times 3. And at the end of the exercise, both myself and the patient felt much better, much calmer. And because we were focusing on the breath or on the timer, we were also able to still quiet the mind. Because when I asked the patient, hey, are you concerned about the pain you were having before? Is the pain as bad? And a lot of the times they say, well, it's there, but it's not as bad as it was before. So something as simple as that can help to sort of ease minor aches and pains, and also help to calm a mind that is sort of running wild. And so that's the 3 breaths per minute exercise, and exactly how it works physically to help change our non-physical mind. And then moving now to physical discipline. I have a great love for sports. I did a lot of sports growing up. I did football, cricket, badminton, swimming, table tennis, all of these things. And what sports does, it helps your body learn to listen to your mind. Because when you're playing a sport, you're already seeing, a really good sportsman will see 2 or 3 steps ahead of what needs to be done, what your body needs to be doing. And so in getting now your body to do what your mind is telling it to do in a sort of quick fashion, that strengthens your mind-body connection. I don't think it's a coincidence that the 3 guys who I mentioned before, they were all sportsmen, And so I encourage anyone who have any parent who has small kids, sports is super important. In addition, it helps with team building, confidence, all that good stuff. But on a personal level, it really does help build that mind-body connection in that way. I'll talk a little bit about yoga, tai chi, and qigong. All of these sort of energy exercises, again, they work on getting your body to do what your mind wants it to do. But in addition, it has another aspect of it. We bring in the breath into the whole thing, because one of the common things with all these 3 exercises, the breath is important. None of these disciplines are, they are safe. They're not demanding. You very rarely get injured, but it's something that you always end up feeling quite energetic at the end of it, and you also have a sense of well-being. Anyone who did any of the exercises will know that you feel you feel well. You have a good sense of well-being after even a couple minutes of yoga or tai chi. And so, and that also helps with activating the vagus nerve and your rest and digest system. Um, Musical instrument. I mean, anyone who's seen my previous webinars knows how much I love music. I actually played some songs in the previous webinar, because music has a profound effect on our physical mind and our mental state, our non-physical mind as well, our physical brain for that matter, and our non-physical brain. And but more profoundly, learning to play a musical instrument or actively producing music has, exponentially greater effect on the mind as well, because you're not just producing a sound that helps your mind, you're actually not actively involved in the production of it. And so that's why most musicians tend to be a little bit more calmer, more relaxed. They tend to be a bit more imaginative and inventive, and they can think laterally and all these things because they have so much more connections in their brain because of their ability to produce music and read music as well. And finally, the final point I'll talk about today is neurofeedback. Neurofeedback is quite interesting. I'll talk about my own personal experience with it. I have a little device here. Let me get it. Right. So I have a little home device here called the Muse. I don't know if you all could see that. And what it is, it has some sensors here that you could see, and it's a brain sensing headband. And so when I put it on like this, right, it's able to sense my brain waves, and it connects to my phone, and I have to use headphones with it to listen to music, and it helps to track my brain. And so using this was just a snapshot of a small meditation I did a couple of months ago. And how the feedback is that, as you notice the bars there's active, neutral, and calm. And you could, above the timeline, you can see little blue birds in a blue circle. What that is, once I am calm, once I'm focused on the music, once I'm at a sort of, my brainwaves are in a calm state, I hear through the headphones, while hearing the music in the background, I hear birds chirping, and so that's how I know I'm on the right track. But let's say, for instance, my mind wanders off somewhere, or let's say, for instance, I start to have an anxious thought. Then, as you can see, my brainwave spiked up twice, and the birds for that period stopped. Actually, depending on how well, for this particular program, depending on how sort of active your brain gets, the birds stop chirping. Then you start to hear like rain falling. Then you hear thunderstorms. So like when your mind is really anxious or active, you actually hear thunderstorms, and that's how you know, oh my goodness, whoops, I'm not in a good place. Let me sort of bring it back down. And so this is neurofeedback, where you wear a device that senses your brain waves, and you're able now to you get external feedback of where you're at. And so now that you have feedback, oh my goodness, I'm stormy, let me sort of be mindful, let me calm myself back down. By doing this enough, right, by practicing to calm yourself back down with the feedback from the device, I can now, without the device in everyday life, I can now say, oh wait, I'm anxious, let me just do what I practiced before and calm myself down. And so this is done professionally. This is just a sort of home device, but this is done professionally. And they connect electrodes. I saw a video of one clinic where they played a video on a screen, and by playing this video, whenever someone wasn't focusing on the video, they would the screen would sort of get dark, and that would tell the person, hey, you're not focusing. And once they focus back on the video, it'll brighten back up again. And so that's neurofeedback, and that's a way of training the brain to be able to come to a calm and peaceful state. So that sort of wraps up the webinar and on mind-body connection. So I have one more slide for this webinar, and I think it's probably the most important slide that I have for 2020. And so I'm quite privileged to share this slide with you all. And this is a slide here. Our mind, how I see it, is the sum total of all of our life experience. I alluded to this before, where how our parents treated us, how our teachers treated us, how our love, our loss, our successes, our failures, all of our life experience makes up our mind, and our mind influences our personality, which is how we use these life experiences to interact with the world. And for instance, if I had a rough childhood, then am I an angry adult? these that's just one example. If I had a lovely childhood, am I a lovely adult? That sort of thing. Our mind shapes our personality, and how we interact with the world, and our personality shapes our personal reality, our abilities, and our limitations. So if anyone in today's webinar is interested in breaking their limitations and increasing their abilities, they must change. The change must start at the level of the mind, right? It has to. That is because it is from there everything flows from. And so I've been challenging myself, and I will continue to challenge myself in 2021 to help break the limitations that I face, and to increase whatever ability I have. And so I leave you guys on this year, for this Christmas season, with a challenge for next year. How best can we lift our abilities, and how best can we break the previous limitations that held us back, that created disease, that created unhappiness, that created frustration? How best can we do that? And so with that, I bring my webinar to an end. Thank you so much for tuning in. And it was an honor and a privilege to be able to present to you guys today and be part of the other webinars while in the chat. Thank you all so much.
That was awesome. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Roshan. I really enjoyed that. That was absolutely wonderful. And guys, I would love to hear your thoughts, not thoughts. I actually want to hear if you have an answer to the question Dr. Roshan asked at the end, because that was a deep question. So how are you going to best lift your abilities going forward, 2020? I know that I didn't get the last part of it, but how are you going to do that? I think that would be if we heard some feedback in the chat, I think that would be absolutely wonderful. Yes, we already have some great feedback. Thank you guys so much. So that was a powerful webinar. Powerful. Roshan, my man's on fire. What are you going to say? Okay, so guys, we're going to take just a moment. I want to go over the other amazing webinars of Dr. Roshan Ramnarine and the Vitality Academy site. So you can, if you're like, oh, this was nice, and you're like, oh, I wouldn't mind a little more Dr. Roshan, then, well, how are you going to get that? You're going to go to the Vitality Academy and you're going to get a little more Dr. Roshan. So give me one sec. I'll pull up the slide for all you wonderful people. And I have them up. Can you just let me know when it comes up, Roshan, please? So guys, if this is your first time here, welcome again. And if you've been here before, welcome back. So
yes, I see it.
Thank you, sir. So what the Vitality Academy is a partnership between myself, I'm a business life coach, etc., and the amazing doctors at the Ishtara Centre in Chaguanas. And it's a group of 4 incredible doctors, all very wonderful in their own ways. And Dr. Roshan, as you just saw, had an amazing presentation. So he did 2 more earlier this year. One, which I think this was the second one. Well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter the order. Discovering, you see it on the right side of the screen, discovering the sacredness of simple things. And that had almost an ability, I think, to almost make a person feel that calmness and find a way to like create the, just to really enjoy the moment more than you would otherwise. I really found it quite profound. And then there's another one he did, which is finding joy in adversity, which is perfect for our blessed year 2020, which has caused so many of us to live a life of upheaval. So these have been really fun. As someone who's kind of like the support staff crew kind of person in the webinar. So what I also love about the Vitality Academy is every instructor is so different in just how we think, how we present, and I really love the variety. So Roshan did an amazing job. Okay, so guys, we're going to jump into questions, and can we unshare our magical slides? You did. Thank you. All right, so let's jump into questions. We have a bunch. Okay, and these should be in order. And there's one I wasn't sure about. I'll get back to it. So the first one's from Gangadai. She's asking, how do you strengthen your gut flora, microbiome?
Sure. I usually suggest that in a 2-way, sort of a 2-pronged approach. The first way is, well, we stop doing things that make our gut unhappy and our gut flora unhappy. So we stop the flour and the sugar, as I talked about in the webinar. And so we stop things that make them unhappy. And then we start things that actually make them happy. So we start, we talk about probiotics and prebiotics. A probiotic is simply happy, healthy bacteria that you invite into yourself, whether you drink something like a fermented food, such as kombucha, kefir, sauerkraut, kimchi, all of those things, or even plain full-fat unflavored yogurt. And so those fermented foods, they're fermented via bacteria. And so when we consume those foods, our gut is seeded with these happy, healthy bacteria. And failing that, there's always sort of probiotic tablets and stuff. When it comes to probiotic tablets, I usually recommend that patients look for a temperature stable one, because a lot of the times these little probiotics are very sensitive to temperature. And yes, they may be stored properly in the pharmacy or the store you buy them, and you may store it properly, but we're not too sure in terms of transport how they were stored. Whether they were stored on a runway that was hot, and shipping it down, all that good stuff. So a temperature stable probiotic is really important if you're going to a tablet. And then we have prebiotics, which are just food for them. And so they are, anything that's slimy, our gut bacteria loves. So like okras, edos, bananas, anything that's sort of slimy, you can eat those foods and you get wonderful prebiotics because they have all these sliminess. There's ratchet that you can use, which is sort of thick-leafed cactus. And so what people do is they sort of peel the ratchet, chop it up into little cubes, and put it into a pitcher of water, and then they have just a glass of that per day, and that's sort of like your daily dose of prebiotic. And what I also recommend to people is okra water, where you can just chop up the okras and same like with the ratchet, pitcher of water, chop it up roughly, and then in the morning take out the okras, and you're left with now a pitcher of pure prebiotic, and that can stay in your fridge for a couple of days. Have a glass of that. If you're constipated, that works really well for constipation as well. That sort of okra water or ratchet water. And so to answer the Gangre's question, it's probiotics, which are happy, healthy bacteria, which you can get from either probiotic tablets or fermented foods, and prebiotics, which are just food for those happy, healthy bacteria, which are anything slimy, or you can take a prebiotic powder, or a prebiotic sort of supplement. That also works as well, because they usually have those sort of slimy foods inside of them. We have a good quality pre and probiotic supplement at Ishtara, and we also have kefir and kombucha and all those things available as well. You can find them in the grocery actually. You just have to look for it, If you're taking kefir, that's fermented. There's milk kefir, which is fermented milk. But I think the kefir that they have is fermented spring water, and kombucha is just fermented black tea. So if you're using those medicinally, you can use them just a couple, 2 ounces, once or twice a day, that sort of thing. Or you could some people just drink the bottle whole. But you have to be careful because if your gut flora is really off, you can get a little diarrhea with that. So taking things that make your gut happy and stopping things that make your gut unhappy. That's sort of how you can strengthen your gut. I think that answers Gangre's. I hope that answers Gangre's question.
Thank you. And then Zalahar says, what method of grounding can you do during the winter months when it's too cold for bare feet? Yeah, so for those who are in the Canada, US,
Yeah, that's a pretty good question.
And I can help with that too once you answer too.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, if you want to take this one, that's perfectly fine. I was just gonna say you could use it's just some earth. So if I think we addressed this in the previous webinar as well, where someone asked if it's all concrete, what do you do? And if better can't be had, you can just get like a potted plant, and you can I just sort of recline and just place my feet inside the pot, so I'm connected there. And that's sort of like the best. Yeah, that's just and you're connected to the earth in a sense there. If better can't be had, that's something I would say. But I mean, I'm happy to hear what you have to say as well.
I love that. Okay, so I'm always standing in these things, by the way, and I stand on a grounding mat.
The grounding mat, yeah, that's awesome. I actually use one at work as well.
So, but the only thing I've heard of the grounding mat, and I heard it from one of the doctors at Ishtara, is the ideal. There's always a good, better, best. The best is to actually have it in the ground connected by a wire.
Yes.
Because of the interference with the other,
Yes.
signals going in the wires.
Not the extension
I don't.
cord.
Yeah, I don't have that. I've connected into the third prong, so I'm kind of doing like good. I'm not doing
Right.
better at best.
Right.
But the
Right.
point is, some level ground is probably better than none. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Correct.
So, all right. Because I had that trouble in the States, and I had to get around to mats because of the pleasures of ice cold. But I didn't know the pot idea. I absolutely love that. All right. Gangarai, another question. God bless you, sister. Would like to know if you can skip breakfast? Heard breakfast is an important meal.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question, Gangarai. So here's my view on the whole thing. I routinely skip breakfast because I do something called intermittent fasting. So I fast. I have my last meal at dinner, and then I sleep. That counts as a fast as well. Then I wake up, and then usually like around lunchtime, early afternoon is when I break my fast. I do not think that when they say breakfast is the most important meal of the day, I don't necessarily agree with them. The reason being is that I believe the reason why it's touted as the most important meal of the day is because they say that it kickstarts your metabolism. That's the usual. Because when I ask people, well, why is breakfast the most important meal of the day? That's the usual response I get. It kickstarts your metabolism. I actually see it a bit differently because when we're in a fasted state, because all of us fast when we're sleeping. And that's usually the longest period of time where we don't consume any food when we're asleep between dinner and breakfast. So when we're in that fasted state, we're actually pretty metabolically active because what we're doing there is we're converting stored energy to active energy, right? And that process of converting stored energy to active energy is actually remarkably metabolically active. Converting glycogen in your liver, moving fat stores, converting them to ketones. So it's remarkably metabolically active. And then when we consume some food now in the form of and that's fuel, we have breakfast, we take on fuel. All right, guys, hang up your boots, no need to work anymore. We have fuel, no need to convert stored fuel into fuel. And so to me, depending on what you eat, it actually lowers the metabolism. The other thing is, I see Noel there said how it's just marketing because it's breakfast companies that say that, but I'm trying to be politically correct, Noel. So the thing is, it's what is breakfast? Most people's breakfast, a typical Trinidadian breakfast is either roti, doubles, aloo pie, something of the sort, or God save the children, it's some cereal loaded with sugar, some chocolate milk, some tea with sugar inside of it. And so none of these things help, and they actively hurt. So I'm actually finding it really hard to see exactly how breakfast is the most important meal of the day. No, I'll say this. Most people, when they begin the process of intermittent fasting, or they say, intermittent fasting sounds awesome, let me do it. And they skip breakfast or whatever meal that they skip, oh man, they get thrown off totally, right? Their stomach growls, they get a gas pain, they feel lightheaded, all of these things. And it's not so much that, oh my goodness, it's an important meal. Is that we are creatures of habit. And so if our body is accustomed to having 3 meals a day at a particular time, like before we even begin to have breakfast, because of that habit, our stomach acid already increases in anticipation of that meal. We're already salivating, all of these things. And so to people who are thinking about intermittent fasting, I urge caution. I say go really, really slowly, because I want to maximize success. And the last thing I would want is for you to try intermittent fasting, feel kind of sick, and then you say, look, this isn't for me, I can't do it, and you sort of throw your hands up and you do it because we're accustomed to it. We're accustomed to having that meal. And like, for instance, most people say, well, doc, if I don't eat, I get a gas pain, so I can't fast. Or if I don't eat, I get lightheaded. And it's because we're accustomed to it. And those people, I say, look, hey, we have 24 hours of fuel stored in our liver, right? I see Princess asked what about diabetics? We actually help a lot of diabetics control their blood sugar via intermittent fasting. And so, but again, for diabetics, they have to go super, super slowly. and they have to check their blood sugar religiously, and they have to be very mindful about how they feel. So what I recommend, and the reason why I recommend skipping breakfast is because you're already in a good fast from dinner to in the morning period. So we can just add to that fast by skipping breakfast rather than trying to fast during the day, you know. And so what I recommend to people is, well, okay, count from the time that you took dinner and what time do you normally have breakfast, and then every week shift back that time by a half an hour, or perhaps every 2 weeks shift back that time by half an hour. That's how slow we're going. Correct. Yeah. So type 1 diabetics are different. And so these are just sort of lifestyle diabetics. I'm talking about type 2 diabetes. Type 1 they have to be very mindful about their insulin. But without getting too specific, by making this shift really, really slow, right, and gradual, it's something that could be done without much heartache, without much feeling of I'm gonna keel over or I'm feeling lightheaded. And because the thing is, to me, an intermittent fast is not a diet. It's not something that I'm gonna stop. This is how I live my life. 5 days a week I intermittent fast. Over the weekends, I have breakfast with my family and I take a break from the fasting. And if I don't feel like fasting a day, I just don't. But because it's a lifestyle, because it's how I live my life, and that's how I propose the patients do it as well. There's no rush to try and get it done. There's no rush to aim for that 16-hour mark. Gradually and slowly build yourself up to it. And this holds true for anything anyone wants to do that's new. Any techniques that we talked about today or any webinar, start off slow, take your time, because acclimatizing is really, really, really important. And that way you maximize success. And it's something now, and the longer change is made, is it's sort of ingrained into us now. It becomes part of who we are rather than a fad. So that's how I recommend it. Really, really slowly, take your time and if you find shifting every week the meal back by half hour is too much, then do 15 minutes. And you just take your time and do it. So that's how I recommend fasting, and I hope that answers the question about breakfast being the most important meal of the day. I hope.
I'm going to interject a bit of humor that Dr. Roshan said. That I think it may have been the first time I've seen him speak. This was at the actual Ishtara Centre, and it was hilarious from someone who's watching it. So he was second or third in line doing. It was a public, back when the third story there, back when they'd have real talks, physical talks, right? And he's like, intermittent fasting is fasting intermittently. Total deadpan. Gave the mic back to Dr. Harry and started, and then it was just so funny because it was just, anyway, I was dying, and I thought it was really, really clever humor.
I try.
Okay, so it's nice to be lighthearted about stuff, right? Okay, so Bina asked a question, and this was a question, Bina. If he does not know the answer, I'll need you to clarify in the chat. Can you advise on how to use the light box helps when you use it? Do you know what she means?
I'm not too sure if she's talking about light box for SAD. Because
she could be, yes.
Yeah. I think the light box for SAD is where I think we talked about it in a previous webinar with SAD, because that's and it was actually in the context of the sleep-wake cycle with melatonin. And so with the light box, it's essentially a box with lights. That's
feel that humor? You liking it, guys?
And so
he's here all night. It's great.
And so but what the light is about, it's actually warm yellow light, which mimics the sun essentially. And this is especially pertinent, not so much in Trinidad because we're a tropical country, but in places like Canada and Europe where it's very overcast. The sun, there are days you go without seeing the sun, and when you don't see the sun for such a long time, you may suffer from something called seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, which I think is a pretty apt acronym, because what it does, it makes you kind of sad, and it sort of makes you kind of depressed and kind of low. And so what I recommend is using the light box, for instance, for a couple of minutes in the morning. That would actually help, maybe 15 minutes to half an hour in the morning. Because that's when naturally you would see the sun first thing in the morning. I don't really recommend using it at night because it's meant to mimic the sun or sun exposure. So I won't use it at night, but I'll use it more in the morning, and if you're home during the day, that kind of thing. So yeah, that's how. And it's really just to put the box in front of you, flick the switch on and just kind of close your eyes and just breathe, because that might help also with the activating the vagus nerve. So that would help quite a lot. That's how I would use the light box.
Awesome. And what I did, because I used to live in upstate New York, where we had the darkest freaking winters on the planet, it seemed. And I have it actually right here. I just totally disobeyed Dr. Roshan's orders of not using a night, but I need it to make myself bright. It's something called the Ott Light. And one of the previous webinars, it has bulbs that are full spectrum. And truly, don't put it on at night. Like when we're done here, I'm flipping that down so I can produce melatonin. But it literally will eliminate melatonin like that. So, okay. So thank you for knowing what Bina meant. Okay, Ellis, can you speak about the connection between heart rate variability, parasympathetic, and sympathetic nervous system, and increasing your performance, getting into the zone and flow? So trying to get into the zone and flow between those three things.
Sure. So heart rate variability deals with heart rate variability.
All night, guys, all night.
Yeah, but no, essentially it's the beat to beat variability, and so is it that it's actually measured in milliseconds, and so is your heart rate beating precisely, or is it sort of like, is it longer, is it shorter, that sort of thing. Dr. Nash, correct me if I'm wrong, because it was with him in a discussion with him that I learned about heart rate variability, is that the higher the heart rate variability is, the better it is, because if it's lower, it means that the heart rate is being sort of crushed by the sympathetic sort of response, and so it's being pop, 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 and so there's not much variability. So essentially, the more stressed out you are, is the lower your heart rate variability is. And so by sort of meditating, exercising, getting your health better, your heart rate and decreasing this sympathetic or this fight or flight response, that helps now to remove this crushing weight of the sympathetic system on your heart, saying beat fast, And so by lifting that off now and allowing your heart rate to variable,
higher is good.
Higher, because the more variable it is, because the parasympathetic nervous system, or the rest and digest part of the nervous system, lowers your heart rate, and the sympathetic nervous system increases your heart rate. And so, if now we're able to our body, our heart is able to respond to both of them, essentially it varies the heart rate. So if your parasympathetic nervous system is dominant, then it will increase the heart rate variability, and it will lower your heart rate. And then if your sympathetic nervous system is dominant, it will increase your heart rate. And so by essentially learning how to balance both of these systems, your heart rate now becomes variable, because it increases your heart rate and it lowers your heart rate. As compared to, for instance, somebody who is chronically stressed out and they have an overabundance of the sympathetic nervous system where it's just beating really quickly, the variability will decrease, so to speak. I don't know if that was clear or not. John, what do you think?
It made sense to me, but I know the language. But
Right.
yeah. So and guys, actually, I think you answered it. It was good. Yeah. I think he did perfect, guys. Okay, Joan. Yeah, Ellis. If it doesn't make sense, we can reword the question.
Yeah.
So Joan, what would you recommend for someone in early stages of dementia? Can this be reversed?
That's a pretty so dementia is a broad term for memory loss, and there's a bunch of different and very specific disease processes that cause dementia. For instance, diabetics suffer from vascular dementia because with diabetics, the blood vessels, because diabetes is a blood vessel disease, and so diabetics because they have affected the blood vessels in the brain, that causes dementia there. As compared to, for instance, Alzheimer's, which is because there's a bunch of plaque in the brain and whatnot from overaccumulation, and so different mechanisms cause dementia. Dementia is this big, broad umbrella, and so it's to give a specific answer to that question is a bit difficult because of the causes are quite varied. I will say, however, that in the early stage of dementia, by building the overall health of the patient, and helping the patient with mindfulness exercises, by stimulating the brain. That has been clinically shown to help. Crossword puzzles, Sudoku, personal connection with people, conversations, showing them pictures, all of these things of the past. All of these things help significantly in halting or slowing the course of dementia. That's a sort of overall general answer I could give to a general disease process, which is dementia.
Quick question, just because I have it here. I take Mentat every day, and
Yeah.
guys that
Yeah,
do it
yeah,
one
yeah,
way,
So,
which has a Bacopa. Is that helpful for
Yes.
dementia?
Bacopa
Helps you with
help.
memory and all that. But
Yes.
so
So it's a really powerful Ayurvedic herb. It's actually called Brahmi, which means it's sort of divine in a sense. And it's used for thousands of years in Ayurveda to help with increasing mental clarity. I also take Bacopa too, and it works phenomenally. It again, depending on the cause, it may help with dementia, but again, it depends on the cause of it.
Makes sense. Makes sense. All right, Noel, is it a good idea to mix ratchet and okra?
I think that's sort of, they're both doing the same thing. And the reason why I recommended the okra water to begin with was because a lot of people didn't have access to ratchet. And I found out the okra, when I did it on my own, did pretty much the same thing as the ratchet water. So I would say either one, because they do sort of like the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Debbie asks, although wheat flour isn't good, is wheat sourdough okay?
So that's a pretty good question, because we've actually tested a few sourdough that we found locally, and some of them they actually came up with high toxicity, and we suspect the reason for that was because they weren't being fermented properly. What cleans up a lot of the toxicity in the wheat is the long fermentation process. Anyone who's made sourdough knows that it takes like a day or two to ferment sourdough, and there's a slow fermentation in a cool environment. That helps not just to develop flavor, but the action of the bacteria on the wheat actually helps to sort of denature and destroy a lot of the toxicity there. Pretty similarly to how the bacteria with yogurt, it helps to destroy all the allergens and the milk proteins there. That sort of creates sort of bad effects from dairy in a sense. So I would be, so the sort of short answer to that question is, I'll be very careful on the sourdough I buy. For us, what each of us do in Ishtara, because I guess our gut flowers are relatively okay. Like, none of us are really gassy or bloaty usually. If we eat sourdough and we get gassy or bloaty, that's a sort of red flag for us. And we sort of gauge how we feel based on how we are when we consume it. So you could even try that yourself. If your gut flora is pretty healthy otherwise, and you're not gassy or bloaty usually, try being mindful and consume your sourdough and see how you feel. That's but that would only reserve for people who actually have a good healthy gut flora, by not being gassy, bloaty, who could fast, that sort of thing. So yeah.
Bina asks, what's the daily recommended protein intake in grams?
I'll have to Google that. I will say this though, I do think that we do consume too much protein, because a lot of people they would talk about use protein powders. They would say I have to eat a certain amount of meat for the day, all these things, and I think because most of us, and I say this speaking to the majority, not the people who exercise, but most of us lead a fairly sedentary life. Even those who take a little walk around the block and stuff, who's a little bit active, there isn't that much of protein consumption. We only burn protein as a source of fuel when we run out of sugar and fats as a form of fuel. And so very rarely do we actually destroy protein and consume it as a form of fuel, unless we're severely malnourished. And there actually have been studies shown that because protein helps to build your body up, like folks who take like protein powder to build muscle, because protein is sort of anabolic, there has been some studies that sort of weakly link it to the formation of tumors, because tumors grow. It activates an enzyme called mTOR, I believe, which is responsible for that. So long story short, unless there's a medical reason for the whole thing, I would really just try to have a balanced diet. Have a couple eggs a week, a couple pieces of sardines for the week, and just eat properly, rather than looking to sort of pick and choose how much protein you get per day. That's just my take on the whole thing. That's how I live my life. So that's why I do.
Awesome. Nicole asks, you mentioned slimy foods, example, okras. Would aloe vera be considered under slimy?
Of course, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And then Deborah, when consuming complete foods and complete combinations, the thing Dr. Harry was talking about recently, should there be a break between this and consuming anything else?
I assume she means a break, like
Almost like if you take your
like
drops
daily?
and you take another set of drops. I think like, let's say you take the honey cinnamon combo
Right.
and then you eat something normal. How long
I
would
think I think that's okay. I don't usually take a break from it. Like so,
Okay.
but then on the flip side, I usually just eat complete food. So for instance, like my lunch, I use the oats blueberries. I put some coconuts and raisins inside there, and then I put something else as well. Another combination, and I just have that as a meal, and that's where I usually get my, and that's what I usually break. That's my first meal for the day, and so I get my sort of dose of complete foods for the day. I did see someone ask a question in chat, John, about if they should break their fast with a fruit. I believe that was the question. And just as we're talking about fast, I wouldn't break fast with fruits. The reason being is that fruits would spike your insulin because of the sort of simple carbs in them. I would recommend breaking fast with something that's either high in fat or high in protein. So, for instance, like a boiled egg, for instance, is perfectly fine. Some nuts, some plain full fat yogurt. These are things I would break my fast with, because if you break your fast with simple carbohydrates, you spike your insulin and you sort of just negate a lot of the good that you did with the 16 hours. So what you break your fast with is just as important as the actual time spent fasting. So so yeah, so that's that in terms of so long story short, I don't think that there's a much of a break needed. I have complete foods a couple times for the day, but I just have it and I use my intuition. If I feel like taking a break, I take a break. If I feel like having one after the other, I would combine them. Just I use my intuition and I sort of play around with it and I see how certain combinations make me feel. And I go with that. So I use my body really to let me know how it is and how I feel. So
And for those that don't know what the heck we're talking about, it was a recent webinar Dr. Harry did. Check the Vitality Academy. You can see it there.
Yep.
You can message me. I forget the name off the top of my head. Okay, 3 more questions. Actually, I'll get the name for you when he answers the question. Aston asks, is there anything at Ishtara that can help with high blood pressure?
So yes. So when it comes to high blood pressure, like I alluded to in the webinar, our main approach with high blood pressure is actually dealing with stress, which happens during a consult. And the reason for that is because that plays a huge role, is very, very common. A lot of people who are diagnosed with high blood pressure actually is really stress-induced high blood pressure, because hypertension is actually a very specific diagnosis that needs to be diagnosed a certain way. Actually, if my medical schooling memory serves me right, it's supposed to be diagnosed sort of 2 weeks apart in 2 separate occasions. And so very rarely that's done. And so, oh, well, your pressure is high. Okay, well, here's some blood pressure tablets in a sense. And I find great benefit in dealing with the actual stress response in people and helping them to cope better with stress. And by doing that, their pressure comes down phenomenally. What it is it comes down over the course of a week or a month or a year. The pressure usually comes down. In addition to coping with stress, if there is actual blood vessel disease associated with the hypertension, there is a supplement we have in Ishara called Cardio FX. That's made by someone called the People's Chemist, and that has 4 ingredients. It has hawthorn berries, grapeseed, magnesium, and garlic. And I found that to be of great benefit when there's blood vessel disease because of the hypertension. So, but again, in Ishtara, I always tell people that at Ishtara, we don't treat disease, we treat people. And so during the consult, during the visit, we go for the source. And so rather than treating the hypertension, we would treat you and treat the cause of all the disease processes. And with that, the blood pressure usually comes down in that sense. So that's the sort of roundabout answer.
Awesome. Awesome, awesome, awesome.
Yep.
And by the way, I love you bringing in the muse. I have a muse and I absolutely love
Hey,
it.
nice.
So, okay, guys, we're out of time. And before I forget, the webinar that Dr. Harry did, it was 2. It was Behind the Mask Part 1 and Part 2. So the Part 1, you kind of introduced the idea, kind of gave a teaser on some of these things. And then Part 2 had a lot of great, powerful, powerful information. So with that, guys, we are out of time, but we appreciate every single one of you for attending. Those who are watching this at any point, we appreciate you. Yeah. Dr. Roshan, thank you again for a wonderful presentation. It was really, really great. Yeah. And any last words before you take off?
No, well, I think that challenge that I threw out at the end of the webinar, I will most certainly hold myself to that challenge in trying to figure out how can I, within myself, every day, just dedicate a few minutes to figuring out how I can break whatever limitations that I accept within myself. I accept, like, and this acceptance is done subconsciously. And so by being a bit mindful about it and bringing it to the fore, I can now sort of start working to sort of undo these limitations. And so I will hold myself to that for 2021. And I sort of hope that you guys as well take up that challenge for 2021, because we need everyone healthy and we need everyone happy, because we had a rough 2020, the whole world. And so we need everyone happy and healthy for 2021 moving forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Dr. Roshan. Everyone, thank you for attending. Have an awesome night. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
All right, guys. Take care. All the best.